Now, tonight's China's incursion over America's heartland is over for now, but not before a massive spy balloon from our #1 geopolitical foe was allowed to float slowly over all over North America now for 8 long days.
So the past week of news about the so-called Chinese spy balloon has to be some of the most ridiculous coverage I've ever seen in my life.
But for some reason, at this hour, no tough words for communist China coming from the Biden White House, just petty finger-pointing aimed at critics as Biden's cowardly, feckless response to this crisis continues to unfold in real time. How dangerous is this for our national security? We'll have a deep dive into that. Now, let us be clear, this balloon wasn't out for a joyride. China was collecting intelligence and absolutely testing your president and the U.S.'s response. Now, day after day went by, and any attempt to assure any of us that they didn't collect intel, frankly, is not credible to me. And is it not possible they had technology that maybe we don't know about? Oh, we stopped them from collecting intelligence. Do you know that for sure? I don't think anybody can answer that question honestly tonight.
So that was Sean Hannity freaking out about this so-called spy balloon that came from China. And I really want to talk about this because both supposedly left and right-wing media has talked about this story and took seriously the idea that these balloons are anything other than standard weather balloons like the Chinese government says that they are. But before we really dive into that, we have to touch on something ridiculous that Sean Hannity says that unfortunately a lot of liberals also agree with.
The ruling government of China, it is evil. The CCP is interested in their own power, their own wealth, their own survival, and nothing else. They will lie, they will cheat, they will steal, they will kill if it benefits them in any way.
No, believe it or not, China is not some magically evil country that's out to do secret malicious things. Not only is that deeply racist, but it's just unbelievably disconnected with the way China's actually engaging with the rest of the world. If you listen to the words of Chinese diplomats, they say very regularly that we need to respect each other's economic and political systems, that we should work together economically for the global sustainability and growth for everyone. Like fundamentally, China is doing everything within their power to avoid Cold War politics, which is why there's so many countries around the world that are increasingly aligned with China, at least diplomatically, because fundamentally they recognize that China has had a non-interventionist policy towards the rest of the world, and they basically just operate on the principle that sovereign nations should be on equal footing. Not to mention, of course, the fact that literally not only does China not have military bases all around the world like the United States does, but they've also spent a ton of money to help other countries develop their infrastructure, perhaps most notably helping Ethiopia to build hospitals. In fact, China is a major part of a larger long-term project of helping Africa get their own CDC as a continent. But so let's really ask this question. What is the whole deal with this news story? Ultimately, I do not think that this was a spy balloon. I'm pretty sure that we can trust the Chinese government a lot more than the United States in this particular instance because we need to ask why. Why would China send a spy balloon when both China and the United States very much have satellite technology? It literally makes no sense whatsoever for China to be using spy balloons when realistically you just simply cannot control the way that these balloons go. It is going to get caught up by the atmosphere and pushed around by the wind. There's not really any instrumentation that you can put on a balloon in order to make it something that you can actually actively navigate. So it'd be a pretty ineffective medium for any type of like spy infrastructure. Then of course there's the reality that like all of the sensors and stuff that you would have to put on it to make it a spy balloon are actually really expensive. And if it's a balloon, it's going to land somewhere that isn't China. And so they would lose all of that. That's just a ridiculous investment. It literally makes no sense to do that. And so it's very, very believable that this is just a weather balloon that the United States shot down, but everybody is just pretending that it definitely is a spy balloon, despite the fact that the United States actually has a very, very long history of lying about situations exactly like this, about claiming that civilian ships were actually military ships, and pretending that American ships were sunk by enemy ships when they really weren't, like the Gulf of Tonkin. And then, of course, there's like the entire Iraq war, which was premised on the false notion of there being WMDs in Iraq. So fundamentally, on an international level, the United States has revealed itself to be deeply untrustworthy and incredibly militaristic. And so nobody's going to say that there's no spying happening on the United States from China. But also, it would be deeply foolish to say that the United States is not spying on China. That's just the world that we live in the year 2023. We kind of know that pretty much every major country has some type of spy operations that they're running in like all the other major countries. That's just the reality of living in a world with states as they exist today. And yeah, that's a reality that we have to accept. But what we don't have to accept is all of this ridiculous racism about China and this fear mongering that somehow China's like planning on taking over the world, when the harsh reality is China is an incredibly peaceful country, and their primary goal over the past several decades has been improving the standard of living for working class people in their country. That is why things like average wages have nearly tripled over the past 10 years. That's why the quality of their education, the public infrastructure that they have, all of these things have been rapidly increasing and improving. And that, I think, is really why the United States sees China as an adversary. They see China as an adversary because under their socialist state-planned economy, they're getting to a point where the average worker in China actually has a lot more free spending cash after their necessities are taken care of than the average worker in the United States. And if there's one thing that wealthy capitalists and the politicians that work for them don't want, is for the American public to see people on the other side of the planet living better lives than we are. Because if we see that, then we might begin to think in our own minds that perhaps some of that socialism stuff is an actual good idea that we might want to apply here. And then on top of that, as China fosters more peaceful trade relations around the world, that undermines the United States' ability to use institutions like the IMF to force countries into structural adjustment programs and austerity measures. And if we can't force countries into austerity measures, that undermines our ability to exploit and use cheap labor around the world to the benefit of wealthy capitalists in the United States and Europe. That is fundamentally why the United States views China as a threat, even while China is actively and diligently sending their diplomats around the world to try and get them to reject engaging in any type of Cold War politics, which is why outside of the United States and the Western world more broadly, people view the United States and Europe and the people who are so terrified of China as being deeply unhinged and disconnected from reality. Because while they're talking about how evil and malicious China is actively investing in these countries and helping them build roads, bridges, hospitals, and other critical infrastructure that's necessary for growing their economy. Where the United States is sending bombs, China is not only sending engineers, but also inviting people from host nations to China to go to Chinese universities to learn how to become engineers so they can go back to their own countries and they won't have to rely on Chinese engineers for doing all of this engineering work, quite literally. While the United States is trying to brain drain the global south, China is actively trying to do these like exchange programs so that people in countries in the global south have real access to education and can work and live on their own times, and they know that their sovereignty will be respected. That is what's undermining the United States. That is the way that China is a threat to the United States, by engaging in peaceful trade relations. And so, is this a spy balloon or is it a weather balloon? If you ask me, I think it's pretty clear that it's just a weather balloon, and that the United States is actively trying to make an international incident out of something in an effort to continue to stir up more fear-mongering about China. Because if you look at other things like TikTok, for example, that the United States and our politicians are fear-mongering about, you can actually see very clearly that research papers have highlighted that the impact of social media like Facebook is actually a heck of a lot worse than TikTok, especially when it comes to things like data privacy. And that looking at TikTok as though it's some sort of like significant or unique evil is just fundamentally disconnected from reality. And yet, people, both presumably on the left and on the right, are doing all of this fear mongering about China. Because if there's one thing that the United States will do consistently more than anything else, it's racism.